we are switching into a different type of a use case of technology and how that interacts with financial services. And that is the Metaverse, another use of technology that's kind of maybe not quite in its infancy, but still at a point of evolution. And it's of course a broader societal technology, but equally has and will have significant transformative impacts on the financial services sector. Here to discuss this with me is Edward Bowles. Edward is the Global Director of Public Policy at Meta Financial Technologies. Ed, thank you very much for making the time to be with me to have this conversation and to understand a little bit more about the Metaverse. Everybody talks about it. Most people I talk to about it don't know what it is, but are far too polite to admit it. So we want to demystify the Metaverse over the next half hour and see how it interacts with the financial services sector. Thanks for being with us.
Well, Nick, it's a real pleasure to join you on this. I look forward to being grilled by you. Congrats to you and your team for putting together a great conference. I watched the panel that's just been on, which was fascinating, and look forward to hearing what Verena's got to say after this.
Thank you. So, starting very clear with a basic point, what is the Metaverse, or what will it be?
Well, those are two very different questions, of course. But let's take the first one. The Metaverse at the moment is, I would say, sort of a nascent concept. It's a term that's been around for just over 30 years, coined by a man called Neil Stephenson in a book called Snow Crash. It was published in June 1992. If there are people on this call, on this webinar, listening, genuinely interested in getting under the skin of the vision behind what the Metaverse will be, I can't think of a better place for them to start than to go and read that book. It's a fantastic piece of very prescient sort of sci-fi visionary stuff. And just a note on the author himself. So Neil has gone from being an author who still writes brilliant books to actually being a man who is now building what will become the Metaverse. He's co-founded a company called Lamina One, which has just released its testnet forking the Avalanche blockchain, which will be one of the integral pieces of, I suspect, the future of the Metaverse. So turning to what it will be from what it is, I mean, at the moment, it's effectively a series of disconnected worlds run by companies like Meta and other organizations like Lamina One, as well as lots of developers who are out there coding in the community. And what we need to get to, and will get to, is the linkages between those different worlds so that you can go into one world and move from that world to another world with your digital ID, your stored value, your digital wallet, your assets that you may have bought, and back again seamlessly without any meaningful frictions. So that's in effect what we're hoping to build towards and doing our bit for.
Maybe let me just drill into that a little bit more. I think it's very clear what you said, but I think given some of the perceptions that we sometimes hear, so if I understand you correctly, the Metaverse is a decentralized structure. The fact that you work for Meta might be inspired by the Metaverse, but does in no way imply some central function or role of Meta in the Metaverse, in the way that we might have seen in some of the platform discussions in recent years. Names not to be mentioned, but this whole question about big tech taking over the world and so on, and everything being concentrated in a number of companies originated in one particular country, slightly to the west, across the Atlantic. Maybe just demystify that point a little bit more, because I think it's very important for the European policy audience.
Look, I'm really happy to address that, and I'm grateful to you for asking it, because it's a key question. We are just one of literally thousands of companies that are currently contributing to building what will become an open and interoperable Metaverse. We are by no means going to be the main company doing it. We will make our contribution, both in terms of the software and the hardware, and we can come to that in a moment. But there is no doubt that there will be many other organizations who both are already building their bits of the Metaverse and will continue to be very significant drivers of creating that experience. And we will just be a player on that particular stage, hopefully working with others. And if you really want to look at some of the detail of that, you can go and look at the number of companies that have joined the Metaverse Standards Forum, which we did help set up in the middle of last year. We were one of 40 founding organizations, some standard setters, some other private companies. Since then, more than 1,500 companies have joined the Metaverse Standards Forum. And the whole point behind that organization is to basically be a driving force for an open and interoperable metaverse, dominated by no individual company or in person.
It's interesting because we had a conversation a bit earlier about the possibility of open source and limitations to open source from a supervisory perspective. And I think in the context of the metaverse, we might come back to some of those issues.
Sure.
But before we come to that, what do you see as some of the economic and social potential transformational benefits that could come from the metaverse? Is it effectively kind of the next evolution of the internet? Is it kind of that type of a transformational kind of technology? What are the expectations there?
Well, I think actually the applications will lend themselves to literally endless means of engagement, whether social, economic, educative, healthcare, and other. We're already seeing really meaningful ways in which companies are using the technology of the metaverse, which, for those of you who've not been into a virtual reality environment, is accessed at the moment through headsets like the sort we make, but many other companies are making headsets that enable you to literally enter a virtual world. It can be a room, it can be an open space, it can be a concert, or it can be a design environment. So BMW, to take an example, is already designing cars and its manufacturing processes in a metaverse built by NVIDIA called the Omniverse. And, that's a brilliant and obvious application where you can have multiple designers and engineers in a virtual room looking at the way in which they are taking forward their investments. From our point of view, what we have already released is something called Horizon Worlds, which is live in the US, Canada, the UK, France, and Spain at the moment. And we are rolling it out across other bits of Europe and the rest of the world in due course. And what that is our bit of the metaverse, where you can go in and go into a gaming environment. If you want to go and play a bit of shoot 'em up stuff in virtual reality with a bunch of others, you can go into a concert environment. You can have a token gated experience. So a developer or a company can build their own world within Horizon Worlds and control access to that through selling virtual tickets in the form of NFT token gated tickets for you to be able to go in and experience that in a virtual way. But I think there are other sort of almost more meaningful cases that have already come to light. And two of those, one of which I directly experienced on the educative side. One of the first ever films, if not, I think the first ever film made in virtual reality for virtual reality, was made by a Polish company called VR Heroes. And they recreated the Warsaw Uprising. And you experience the Warsaw Uprising in that film as a first party participant. And I happened to watch it with a Ukrainian colleague of mine whose families were going through more or less exactly that same experience in Kyiv at the time, sitting in shelters, waiting for the invasion and so on. And, these sorts of things are incredibly powerful and moving experiences. And from an educative point of view, something that you will never forget.
Maybe another use case that comes to mind, you mentioned it earlier, is around medicine and research. Maybe just give me one other example that goes beyond, let's say, the pure education or entertainment into other kind of use cases.
Yeah, sure. So we know, surgeons around the world are now being trained using virtual reality. But in fact, last year, there was a groundbreaking operation that took place in Brazil to separate conjoined twins, two boys, age 3, whose parents, when they first approached the medical authorities in Brazil, were told the operation was simply not possible. It was too complicated and difficult. And a British surgeon working for the Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital heard about this and offered to intervene because he very much believed actually the surgery could take place with the use of virtual reality technology. And he did some fundraising and got the consent of the parents, and built 3D models of the children's skulls. The skulls were fused themselves, and then worked with a very large medical team of about 120 staff, surgeons and others, to prepare for what became a 27-hour operation. They rehearsed that operation for 2 months in VR using our headsets, and then executed the operation successfully and publicized it only after 3 months had elapsed to ensure that the children had survived the operation. And the 2 boys now alive and separated, living independent existences as part of a family that might not otherwise have happened.
Fascinating. Thanks for sharing that example, Ed. Now, this is, of course, a FinTech and regulation conference. And I know we
Sure.
call this a tech talk because we want to go beyond the core regulatory issues to what actually is happening in the markets, what's happening, how new technologies are being developed and used. But coming back to the financial services side of things, you talked about ticketing. You used the example of somebody developing their world within your world or developing another interoperable world and charging a certain amount for the use of that application. Now, so non-fungible tokens, NFTs, are one way or are the way that these tokens might be, charged for, sold, traded, whatever you want to use it. But we will have tomorrow discussions about crypto assets. We've already touched with Jose Manuel, for example, a bit earlier on stable coins. We will have a conversation tomorrow about digital assets. A lot of different terms flying around at the moment, all meaning something slightly different. So maybe demystify what an NFT is or is not, and how it relates to crypto assets, if at all.
Yeah.
And what the implications therefore are also from a public policy perspective.
Yeah, a really interesting interlocking set of issues, which, by the way, I think is probably worth starting with saying that the European regulators and policymakers already began to address this when they went through the MiCA conversations last year, and particularly the trialogues, where the approach to NFTs was one of the sort of final issues to be resolved in the trialogues of MiCA, which, and I congratulate them on coming to the sensible conclusion, which is they did, which was, NFTs basically are not financial instruments, and therefore don't belong in a piece of legislation that deals basically with financial services. And we refer to the utilization of NFTs in our world as digital collectibles. That's the applications that we are supporting the first case use of, which is in effect digital art that is stored on a blockchain and can be minted or sold leveraging blockchain technology. And we last year launched that capability to link third-party wallets, digital wallets, with Facebook and Instagram. And I have to say, we were pretty surprised at how quick the take-up was. We were sort of aiming for about 100,000, and we hit 400,000 in about the same time frame. People linking their wallets and wanting to display the digital collectibles that they had already bought on their profiles. And we've now moved to the next stage of that in the US, and enabling individuals to both mint and sell digital collectibles on their thing. Now, digital collectibles are literally what they are, which is it's a piece of art. And that is no more a financial instrument than if it was a physical piece of art sitting on your wall in your house, and shouldn't be treated any differently. Crypto assets, broadly speaking, obviously the one thing they have in common with NFTs is the use of cryptographic technology on blockchain to try and reduce the risk of cyber hacking, fraud, and other sorts of activities that do happen in this world. But that's pretty well where the similarities end. The way in which NFT-based technology, smart contracts that underpin the things that you might see as a digital collectible, are evolving includes registers, property registers, for example. They include the ability to serve legal proceedings in the High Court in the UK and in the US. These things are, now starting to evolve in that way, and you wouldn't be looking to regulate those as financial instruments either. But I very much understand the concern of policymakers who look at what's going on in this space and see the pace of innovation and the scale of innovation, and particularly some of the more recent incidents involving other ends of the crypto spectrum, where incidents have come to light that need intervention. But I think I would start by saying to them, same risk, same regulation. And so look very carefully at what it is that is being used and treat it appropriately, and not stifle innovation by treating something that isn't a financial asset as a financial asset.
It's interesting you say that. Tomorrow we have actually a session just after lunch with two colleagues from Afore talking about the possibility of NFT technology being used for electronic contracts. Again, not financial instruments, but the use of contracts in this case in the context of import and export activities.
Right.
And I think it comes to your High Court example as in a way an electronic representation of a right. But obviously, if the NFT market takes off even more, individuals have their individual wallets. How do you expect traditional financial institutions interact with the metaverse? At a minimum, they will be there to try and facilitate payments for these NFTs between different parties. Maybe starting with that. So how do you see that interaction between established financial or newly emerging financial institutions that are authorized and regulated under European law and the metaverse?
Yeah. Well, of course, payments are central to what will become the ecosystem of the metaverse. If you don't have a viable economic environment where people can be paid for the digital assets that they are creating, then it's not going to succeed. And so therefore, at the moment, if you came into Horizon Worlds with your ID that it is, you will have probably some credentials attached to that ID in the form of either a credit card or a debit card attached to it, which you may use outside of that world to donate money to friends who are fundraising for a particular charitable activity. But in Horizon Worlds, you may want to buy a virtual ticket to attend a virtual event, a concert, for example, or you might want to buy some digital clothing for your avatar. So you're going to need, at the moment, what is readily available. Now, for most people outside of the sort of the crypto world, that is just their fiat accounts that they have with banks, e-money institutions, and others. But obviously, there is an incredibly burgeoning role for cryptographic currencies and associated technologies, which at the moment tends to be either stable coins or pure play non-backed cryptocurrencies. You probably saw Circle's report earlier this week, the sort of the state of the industry report, where they published for the first time a figure that suggested there was some 7 trillion worth of activities settled in stable coins in 2022, which is a fairly phenomenal sum of money for financial activity. Obviously, nothing of that scale is happening in the metaverse at the moment or in Horizon Worlds. But what I think you will see when you have interoperability is people wanting to use some form of digital technology. And the question then is, for established banks and e-money institutions and their regulators, at what stage do they start to embark on offering services that are not merely fiat payment-based ones?
I mean, we'll have Dante Desparta speaking tomorrow about Circle and how Circle is evolving.
Excellent.
But and it'll be interesting how he kind of, in a way, responds to this conversation. But I can see the possibility of cryptos or stablecoins being used for payments in the future in the metaverse. But we have this debate at the moment around the digital euro. Why not use effectively or continue to use your established wallet and your established credit or debit card or your instant payment directly from a bank account transferred? Why this link potentially between the metaverse and stable coins or crypto payments or the digital euro? Why that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Nick. I mean, look, and I think the answer to the question is dependent upon the evolution of what will become the metaverse, in the sense that the linkages between one world and another and the ability to port assets between one world and another in a seamless and interoperable manner will be largely driven by the capabilities of blockchain technology. And at the moment, your average fiat stored value and credentials and accounts are not sitting on the blockchain. And that is where I think the role of a digital fiat, whether it's the euro, a pound, a digital dollar, rupee, or real in Brazil, will have a meaningful potential retail use case, so that you have something that ordinary customers who are not crypto heads will see, know, recognize, and trust in the same way that they would with the same hard currency in their pockets, or indeed with the e-money version as well on a non-blockchain wallet approach. And if that gives them greater comfort, then that, I hope, will become available to people in the not too distant future as the metaverse itself evolves and sees more need for blockchain-based means of interoperability and portability.
Interesting. I will not put you on the spot. I just kind of report back. We discussed the digital euro at some length in the panel earlier today, and it was reiterated, as Fabio Panetta has done in the European Parliament on numerous occasions and otherwise, that the digital euro will not be, at least initially, meaning for the first years, until the early 2030s at least, blockchain supporting. So, I can
understand why that's the case, but I think as you see more applications being driven by blockchain technology, and I again refer to the work of companies like Lamina One, but far from limited to those, you'll see the increased use cases for that grow. And I just sort of draw attention to colleagues listening to this. There was a really excellent report published by the Electric Capital organization about 2 weeks ago it's an annual report on the number of developers going on and working in a basically self-employed way, writing code in the different sorts of crypto communities. And although the value of cryptocurrencies themselves has gone down by some 75%, the number of developers writing code full-time has actually gone up over the same time frame. And you now have something in excess of 23,000 full-time coders working across Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, and other communities who wrote in 2022 something like 230 million lines of code. All of that is to say there is a lot of activity in this space, and the pace of innovation that is leveraging blockchain technologies and associated applications, both in the public sphere and in the private sphere, are growing. And so therefore, when public organizations start to think about how they integrate with this, they need to have a very clear eye on what's going on beneath the surface in decentralized communities where a lot of this activity is taking place, not merely on the large stage of companies like mine and Circle and others.
And you'd be happy to hear that the non-bank payment industry and process is pushing for a quick development of a blockchain-based digital euro and not just an account-based one. So it's also in sync with what you're saying.
Yeah.
I mean, you've just alluded or started to raise the issue about what you would ideally like to see from regulators and policymakers. And maybe to conclude, I just would like to explore that a bit more. In the current environment, what are the type of things that you would like to see from a public policy community in Europe to facilitate the metaverse and help Europe stay ahead or come to the front of the digital innovation debate that the von der Leyen Commission is so eagerly trying to promote?
Well, I think they need to have a broad approach to engaging with industry. And when you publish a consultation, you're hardly going to get anything other than the large-scale organizations who are reasonably well-resourced engaging with a formal consultation, for example, whether it's about the digital euro or in the context of MiCA. I'm having been involved in the MiCA conversations, it was pretty clear to me that there were very little, indeed no, creators out there engaging with the potential implications of MiCA for those who were really building digital assets at a sort of an SME scale for their own businesses and others. And we published a paper on the 2nd of December last year that made 3 particular observations and recommendations for policymakers. And the first is really approach things from a same risk, same regulation perspective. Be very clear and deeply researched in what it is you're engaging in when you're thinking about regulating. Secondly, do recognize the role played by the decentralized and less centralized communities in this space. It's an incredibly powerful motor of innovation and finding a means by which, and I think the obligation's on policymakers, not on the decentralized community, find a means of engaging more deeply to understand what's going on in that world. Because the sheer pace and scale of innovation and work is truly meaningful. And the third element there is really therefore try and embed all of that in much deeper public-private partnerships and means of collaboration than I think are hitherto really the case. And there's a lot more that we can do together, I think, to come to sort of the right framework for supporting innovation across Europe and elsewhere.
It's interesting you say that, because one of the themes that seems to be clearly emerging from this conference is that of dialogue. It started off really early today with pleas for more conversations between the technology sector and financial services regulators, understanding each other, understanding each other's role, the interface between the regulated institutions, non-regulated institutions, the dependencies, the partnerships. In the way you speak to that, but you're taking it to a more granular level, in that you say it's really speaking to individuals or smaller companies, innovators, and bring them into the community. Not sure quite how Brussels will be able to do that effectively, but I see your point. That's maybe part of the design challenge that the EU has. But it's very encouraging to hear the same theme emerging. If I maybe can close on one question, which is MiCA. MiCA came up, of course, a lot of times already, and will come up much more tomorrow. But again, we speak to Verena in a moment, Verena Ross from ESMA, who's more charged with the implementation of MiCA. But José Manuel Campa talked about stablecoins and the work that they will have to do by October this year, start consultations on level 2 measures. How do you see MiCA as a framework? You already said NFTs are for now, not exclusive, wrong word. It's recognized that there aren't crypto assets in the sense of MiCA and therefore are not in the scope. But if you look at the regulatory framework as such, as a way of trying to capture these new evolutions of blockchain-driven or largely blockchain-driven financial solutions, how do you rate MiCA in comparison to frameworks in other parts of the world?
Look, I thought it was a really good first endeavor to capture in a regulatory framework the way in which this technology is evolving and enabling the economies of the world to adapt to becoming increasingly digitized. And the fact that there are multiple different roles for different types of currencies out there is recognized in MiCA. Having it as a level 1 text is always challenging given the speed with which this technology is evolving. And the UK has just published a consultation last week on their approach to regulating crypto, where they've clearly used MiCA as a reference point, which shows the value of a lot of the work that was done there. But I think that they're hoping to achieve quite a lot of the regulatory stuff at secondary legislation and rulemaking levels, rather than being dependent upon primary legislation, which I think is going to be a quicker way and a more flexible way of keeping regulation up to speed with the pace of innovation than perhaps level 1 texts enable you to. And so for the UK, for the EU to think about how MiCA will evolve will means they might have to find something slightly more nimble than a level 1 text approach as the next stage of reviewing MiCA.
Also, that has been something that's been on our mind for some time, how to create a more faster, adaptive regulatory framework at the European level to deal with this innovation. Ed, it was a real pleasure speaking to you.
Likewise.
And helping us to demystify a little bit what the metaverse is and can be, and how the financial services sector can and should fit into this. Hopefully we see you in person next time, when we kind of might do it in person again, so to speak. And thanks for being with us.
A pleasure. Cheerio.
Thanks.